The town of Harrow Creek, Montana, sat in a valley the mountains had spent a century trying to swallow back. It was the kind of place that didn't fail dramatically. It failed quietly, the way an old man's hands fail not all at once, but joint by joint, season by season. Until one morning you wake up and realize you can no longer make the thing you were put on earth to make. The gas station on Route 12 still ran on stubbornness and a single working pump. The diner opened 4 days a week. The hardware store had been shuttered long enough that the plywood over its windows had begun to warp and cup at the edges, pulling away from the frame like skin pulling away from a wound that never properly healed. The logging truck that dropped Silas Cord at the edge of the gravel lot didn't slow all the way down. It was that kind of drop-off, the kind where the driver knows there's nothing left to say, so he doesn't say it. Silas stepped down from the running board with a canvas pack over one shoulder and a rolled tool belt under his arm. He stood in the gravel and didn't watch the truck go. Men who had been moving for 3 years learned early that watching things leave only made the leaving feel like something it wasn't. He was 67 years old. He had the hands of a man who had worked wood his entire life, wide across the palm, thick through the knuckle. The skin creased in patterns that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with use. His back was straight in the way that backs go straight when a man has spent decades bending over a workbench and has made a private agreement with his spine not to surrender to it. His face was the face of a man who had been weathered rather than aged. There is a difference. Aged means time did it. Weathered means you were outside for most of it. He bought a candy bar and a bottle of water from the gas station clerk with the last folded bill in his shirt pocket. The clerk looked at him the way people in dying towns looked at older men arriving on logging trucks with tool belts under their arms. Not with contempt exactly, with a tired kind of recognition, like they'd seen enough arrivals to know that nobody came to Harrow Creek with good news. Silas didn't ask about work. He could read a town the same way he read wood, by looking at the grain, the stress marks, the places where something had bent under weight and never fully returned to straight. Harrow Creek had nothing left to offer a man who needed wages. But Silas Cord hadn't come for wages. He wasn't entirely sure why he had come at all. That was the truth of the last 3 years. He moved because stopping meant sitting still long enough to think about the house on Caldwell Road in Bozeman that had belonged to his father and his father's father, and to Silas for 22 years after that. The house he had repaired, board by board, rafter by rafter, replacing what time took with something better, because he knew how. The house that was no longer his name on any legal document in the state of Montana because his son Dean and a lawyer named Hargrove had spent 18 months rearranging papers while Silas was caring for his wife in her final year. And by the time Eleanor passed and Silas looked up from grief, the house was gone. Not burned, not condemned, just transferred, legally, efficiently, without a single raised voice. He had stood in the county clerk's office in Bozeman and looked at the documents for a long time. The clerk had shifted uncomfortably. Silas had not shouted. He had not wept. He had looked at the papers the way he looked at a piece of wood that had been cut wrong, with the quiet, absolute recognition that this could not be undone, only understood. Then he had picked up his tool belt and walked out. That was 3 years ago. Since then, fence repair in Wyoming. Foundation work in Idaho. A 2-month stretch in eastern Oregon helping an old rancher re-side a barn that had been leaning toward the southeast for 15 years. Silas had straightened it. He always straightened things. It was the only language he fully trusted. He stood at the edge of Harrow Creek's main street in the thin October light and let his eyes move the way they always moved, not looking for anything in particular but reading whatever was there. The storefronts, the angle of the eaves, the way the sidewalk had heaved and cracked where a tree root had been fighting the concrete for 20 years and finally won. At the far end of the street past the shuttered hardware store and the post office with its faded flag, the land tilted upward. The buildings gave way to timber and rock, and at the base of the eastern ridge, half buried in alder and grass and the patient work of decades, he saw the rails. He stood very still for a moment. Railroad tracks did something to Silas Cord that he could not fully explain. He had grown up near a spur line in western Montana, and as a boy, He had understood instinctively what most people took years to learn, that tracks were not abandoned in the way that buildings were abandoned. A building left empty eventually lost its purpose, but tracks went somewhere. They had been laid with intention, surveyed, measured, spiked down by men who were thinking about a destination even as they drove each nail. That intention didn't leave when the train stopped running. It stayed in the steel. It stayed in the grade. He adjusted the strap on his pack and started walking. The grade was gentle for the first quarter mile, threading through alder scrub and creek willow that had colonized the gravel bed over decades. Silas moved beside the rails rather than on them, his boots finding the packed earth between the ties and the encroaching brush. He didn't hurry. He had learned in the years since Bozeman that hurrying was a way of pretending you knew where you were going. He didn't know. He rarely did anymore. But the tracks went somewhere deliberate, and that was enough. The slope steepened past the first ridge shoulder. The trees pressed closer, and the sky narrowed to a pale ribbon overhead, the kind of October sky that carries the promise of snow in the way that certain silences carry the promise of words not yet spoken. His breath came measured and even. His knees, which had opinions about hills, kept those opinions to themselves. He had made an agreement with his body years ago, the same agreement he had made with his spine. "You carry me," he had told it, "and I'll give you work worth doing." He came around a long curve of limestone, and the valley changed entirely. The walls on either side of the track bed stepped inward and rose pale gray stone going vertical in faces that climbed 60-70 feet above him, narrowing the sky to a single strip of blue. The scrub gave way to fern and moss, where the rock stayed damp in the shadow of the overhangs. The temperature dropped 4 degrees between one step and the next. He could hear water somewhere, a thin, persistent sound like the mountain was breathing through a very small gap. The silence in the canyon was different from the silence on the open ridge above. It was a contained silence, the kind that felt deliberate. His footsteps on the gravel sounded careful. He slowed without deciding to. The east wall of the canyon had a long overhang 30 feet above the track bed, a shelf of stone that jutted outward before the cliff continued rising. Below it, where the stone met the grade, something interrupted the pale limestone. Dark, rectangular, too regular to be shadow, too solid to be trick of light. Silas stopped. He looked at it the way he had learned to look at things that might matter steadily, without rushing toward a conclusion, letting his eyes do their work, without interference from his expectations. He stood there for nearly a full minute. Then he stepped off the grade and moved toward the base of the cliff. The dark rectangle resolved itself as he came closer. A door. Timber framed set directly into the cliff face, where a natural vertical crack had been widened and shaped by hand tools. The door itself was horizontal tongue and groove planking, once painted a dark green that had faded to almost nothing under 40 years of dry season dust and wet season runoff. Vines had grown across it in a loose curtain. The bottom edge had swollen against the stone threshold with decades of absorbed moisture. Silas stood in front of it and did not move for a long moment. He reached through the vines and touched the planking. His palm went flat against the wood the way a doctor's hand goes to a pulse, not pressing, just receiving. The wood was dense. Old-growth timber, the kind with grain so tight you had to look twice to count the rings. He knocked with his knuckles. Not the knock of a man at a door. The knock of a man checking for rot. The wood answered with a dull, solid sound. No hollow, no soft spot. He found the latch by feel iron, surface rusted, simple bar and bracket. He worked the blade of his folding knife into the gap and lifted. The mechanism moved on the first try, stiff but not seized. The door resisted when he pulled. He gave it a steady, even pull, not sharp, not impatient. He felt it break from the swollen threshold with a low groan that the canyon walls threw back at him from both directions. Cool air came out, not cold, cool and still with a smell he recognized immediately and completely, the smell of closed rooms that had been built well and sealed tight and left undisturbed for a very long time. It was not the smell of rot or ruin. It was the smell of time preserved rather than time wasted. There was a difference. Silas had been in enough old buildings to know the difference by the first breath. He clicked on the small flashlight from his coat pocket and stepped inside. The beam swept the room in slow arcs, the way his eyes had swept the canyon, without hurry, without demand. He saw a floor of tongue-and-groove planking. He saw walls of rough stone on 3 sides, the fourth being the timber-framed cliff face through which he had entered. He saw a workbench against the far wall draped in canvas. He saw a narrow cot frame in the corner with a rope-sprung base. He saw a small cast-iron stove with a stovepipe disappearing upward through the ceiling. He stood in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. Then he crossed to the workbench and folded back the canvas. What he found stopped him entirely. Hand tools hung on a board above the bench in square-cut pegs, each one in its place. Planes arranged by size, a jointer, a jack-a-shoulder plane at the end. Chisels in graduated widths, each one with a handle that had been shaped on a lathe rather than factory cut. A draw knife with its handles wrapped in leather that had dried and cracked but held. A brace with its bits in a leather roll, each bit cleaned and oiled before being rolled away. Silas reached out and took the shoulder plane from its peg. He turned it in his hands. The blade was not keen. Decades in a closed room took keenness from any edge. But the bevel angle was right, and the back had been flattened by someone who knew what flat meant, not someone who guessed at it. The mouth of the plane was set to a gap no wider than a human hair, which was the gap of a man who took very fine shavings from difficult grain and had learned through long practice that patience in the setup saved struggle in the work. This was not a shelter built by a man in need. This was a shelter built by a man in possession of himself. There was a difference between the two, and Silas had seen enough of both to know which one he was looking at. Something moved in his chest that was not quite recognition and not quite memory. It was something between the two, the feeling of a word on the edge of the tongue, the feeling of a familiar voice heard from the next room before the words are clear enough to understand. He set the plane back on its peg with the same care he had taken it down. He checked the stove. The flue was clear. The firebox held compacted ash from a fire built a very long time ago, cold and dry with no smell of anything recent. He found firewood stacked beside the stove, old but dry, protected from moisture by the overhang above and the density of the structure around it. He built a fire the way he always built fires, small at the base, tight enough to catch and draft before it spread, because a fire built right from the beginning didn't need to be corrected later. He lit it on the 3rd match. Within 20 minutes, the room had warmth in it, and Silas sat on the stone floor with his back against the wall and let his eyes go over everything again, with the patience of a man who understood that a room well examined once was worth 10 rooms examined quickly. He catalogued what he saw. The stone walls chinked with a mortar that had been mixed correctly, not too stiff, not too loose, and pointed with a tool, not a finger, because a man who pointed mortar with his finger was a man in a hurry. And whoever had built this room had not been in a hurry. The floor planks were tight-fitted with no visible gaps, which meant they had been dried before installation to whatever equilibrium the canyon air would eventually bring them to, which meant whoever laid them had understood wood movement and worked with it rather than against it. The tongue and groove boards on the door were fitted with the same intention, tight, precise, the joints barely visible. He found the ledger on the back shelf behind a wooden crate. Black-bound hardcover, the spine cracked but intact. He carried it to the stove and sat down with it open on his knees. The handwriting was small and economical, the kind of handwriting that came from a person who had learned to write when paper was not taken for granted. Each letter placed deliberately, no flourish, no waste. The first entry was dated April 1961. The last entry he could find was dated March 14th, 1969. He read for an hour. The early entries were practical supply lists, measurements, notes on the drainage of the canyon floor during snowmelt, observations about the water seeping from the cliff face and how it might be redirected into the structure, notes on timber selection, which species held up in the enclosed humidity of the canyon, which ones moved too much with seasonal changes in moisture. The writer had tried 3 different species before settling on the dense, slow-grown pine that made up the floor and door. The middle entries included more about the work itself, how long it took to dress each plank by hand in a space with no power, How the cast-iron stove had to be brought in before the door was framed because it would not fit through any opening he could reasonably build into a cliff face. There were entries about the stovepipe, about the chimney, about 2 winters spent improving the drawer until smoke moved up and out without hesitation. The later entries changed in tone. Quieter, more careful with their words, the way a man gets careful when he suspects he may be observed. And then on a page near the end of the book, Silas read something that made him stop. The writer described a technique for reading the grain of a piece of old-growth pine, how to look at the end grain to determine the rate of growth, how to read the surface grain to find the tension wood and the compression wood and understand which way the plank would try to move under stress. He described the correct angle for a hand plane on quarter-sawn stock, the feel of the cut when you were going with the grain versus across it, the particular sound a well-tuned plane made on clear, dry, tight-grained wood, a sound the writer compared to a long, clean breath. Silas set the ledger down on his knee and stared at the stove. He had heard that description before. Not read it, heard it. Spoken aloud in a workshop in a town called Mineral Springs in the autumn of 1974, when Silas Cord was 24 years old, and learning the trade from a man who believed that the way a person worked wood told you everything you needed to know about the way a person worked at anything. The man's name had been Walt. Just Walt. Silas had never known his last name in the careless way of young men who take for granted that there will be more time. Walt had left Mineral Springs in the winter of 1974 abruptly and without explanation, and no one had said much about it. The shop closed. Silas had moved on to other work. Other towns carrying what Walt had taught him, the way you carry a language you learned young, not by thinking about it, but in your hands, in your habits, in the way you approach a problem. He picked up the ledger and turned to the inside front cover. There was a name written there in the same small, careful hand. Not on the first page where a name might be written casually as an identifier, but on the inside of the cover itself, pressed into the board with a pen point that had been pushed down harder than the rest of the handwriting, as if the writer wanted it to be the last thing to go if everything else faded. Walter Kane. Silas looked at the name for a long time. He reached into the front pocket of his canvas pack and found what he was looking for. By touch, a photograph folded twice and soft at the creases from years of handling. He unfolded it carefully. A black and white print slightly overexposed on the left side where the shop window had been. 2 men standing at a workbench. The younger man was Silas at 24, grinning in the way young men grin when they're proud of something they've just learned. The older man stood beside him with his arms crossed and the look of a man who had made something good and knew it. He was not grinning. He was simply present the way craftsmen are present completely without remainder. Silas held the photograph next to the name in the ledger. The man in the photograph and the man who had built this room were the same man. Walter Kane had not left Mineral Springs in 1974 because he wanted to. Walter Kane had run. And he had run here into a canyon that no map showed and no road reached. And he had built himself a room inside a cliff face and lived in it and worked in it and kept records of it for 8 years before whatever had been following him had come close enough that he had written those final careful words on the last page of his ledger and then disappeared from the world entirely. Silas set the photograph on his knee beside the ledger. The fire ticked in the iron stove. The canyon outside was entirely dark now, the last of the October light long gone. The water in the cliff face made its low, continuous sound through the stone, the same sound it had been making for centuries, indifferent to everything that happened on the other side of the rock. He sat with the photograph and the ledger and the fire for a long time. He was thinking about a man who had taught him to read grain and set angles and understand the difference between the wood that held and the wood that looked like it held, but didn't. He was thinking about the fact that Walter Kane had built this room alone, had packed material into a canyon with no road, had set every joint by hand, had hung every tool in its place, and had done all of it in a kind of magnificent, deliberate invisibility. He was thinking about the locked drawer on the far side of the room, the one with a nail driven through the wooden pull at an angle seated into the face of the drawer front, just firmly enough to require intention to remove. He had noticed it on his first sweep of the room. He had not touched it. Some things required you to earn the right to open them. He was not ready yet. He set the ledger on the floor beside him and lay back on the cot, with the 2 wool blankets pulled to his chest. Both of them still good, protected from damp and moth damage by the sealed room and the dry canyon air. And he looked at the ceiling. The planks above him had been dressed by hand. He could see the long, clean strokes of a hand plane running in the same direction across every board, going with the grain, taking fine shavings, leaving a surface that had never been sanded, because a man who planed correctly had no need to sand. Every plank, the ceiling, the floor, the door. A man who had done that much work had done it for a reason that went beyond shelter. Shelter you could build quickly and roughly, and it would still keep the rain off. This kind of work, this level of care given to surfaces no one would ever see once the ceiling boards were nailed up. This was something else entirely. This was a man proving something to himself. Silas understood that. He had been proving something to himself for 3 years, moving from job to job with a tool belt and a folding knife, and the absolute refusal to become the kind of man who accepted what had been done to him as the final word on who he was. Walter Kane had done the same thing, and he had done it inside a cliff on an abandoned rail grade in the mountains of Montana, and no one had known about it for 56 years. He turned off the flashlight. The stove gave enough glow through its air vents to keep the dark from being total. Outside the canyon, the wind moved through the timber on the ridge, a low, even sound far enough above him that it barely registered. The creek ran somewhere to the west, consistent, unhurried. He was almost asleep when he heard it. Boots on gravel. Below the canyon on the rail grade, moving with the deliberate cadence of a man who was not lost and was not in a hurry, and was trying to make as little noise as possible while still moving at a pace that meant business. Silas opened his eyes. He lay completely still. The stove ticked. The boots on gravel came closer, slowed at the point where the cliff face would have become visible, a distance Silas estimated at 30 yards based on the way sound traveled in the canyon, and then stopped. A long silence. Then a light swept the cliff face above the door. Not a flashlight beam searching. A flashlight beam that already knew where to point. It moved across the overhang, across the vines at the door, down to the ground where Silas's boots had disturbed the gravel and left impressions in the soft earth at the base of the cliff. The light held on the boot prints for a count of 5. Then it clicked off. Boots on gravel again, retreating, moving back down the grade toward the valley below. Not running, walking. The walk of a man who had seen what he needed to see and was already thinking about what to do with it. Silas lay on the cot in the dark and listened until the sound was gone entirely. Then he lay there a while longer. Whoever that was, they had not been surprised by the door. They had known where to point the light, which meant they had been to this canyon before, and they had found the door before, and the only reason they had not opened it themselves was that something had stopped them or someone had told them to wait. Silas looked at the ceiling he could no longer see. He thought about the nail in the drawer pull. He thought about the last entry in the ledger. He thought about Walter Kane walking out of Mineral Springs in the winter of 1974 with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge in his hands. He thought about his own house on Caldwell Road. The legal documents spread across the county clerk's desk the way his son Dean had looked at him in the parking lot outside the clerk's office. Not with guilt exactly, but with a particular kind of blankness that Silas had not understood then and was beginning to understand now. The kind of blankness a man wore when someone else had told him what to do and he had done it and had worked very hard not to think about it too carefully since. The kind of blankness that came with instruction. Outside, the canyon was completely silent. The creek ran. The mountain held everything it had always held, indifferent and vast, waiting with the patience of stone for the next thing to happen at its feet. Inside the room that Walter Kane had built alone in a place no one was supposed to find. Silas Cord lay in the dark and did not sleep. He was thinking. He was reading what was in front of him, the way he read grain, looking for the stress marks, the tension lines, the places where something had been bent under weight and forced to hold a shape it had not chosen. He was reading it slowly, without hurry, because he had learned a long time ago from a man in a workshop in Mineral Springs, Montana, that the work done at the beginning determined everything that came after. He lay still and he thought. And outside, the mountain held its silence as it had always held it, without apology, without explanation, the way things hold that were built to last. Morning came into the canyon slowly, not the way morning came on open ground all at once and without apology. In the canyon it arrived in stages. First, a pale thinning of the dark above the cliff rim. Then a gradual brightening of the stone walls that had nothing to do with direct sunlight and everything to do with reflected sky, and finally, almost an hour after the ridgeline above had gone gold. A single band of actual light that crossed the canyon floor at a low angle and lasted exactly long enough for a man to read by before the walls took it back. Silas was already awake when it came. He had not slept well, not from cold. The iron stove had held its heat through the night with the patient efficiency of good cast iron, and the wool blankets had done their work. He had not slept well because his mind had been working in the way it worked when a problem presented itself that his hands could not yet reach. He was a man who solved things by doing them. The thinking without doing was the harder part, always had been. He rebuilt the fire from the coals that remained a handful of dry bark, 2 splits set at an angle. The draft opened a quarter turn. Flame caught inside a minute. He heated water in the small tin cup he kept in his pack and made coffee from the last of the grounds, folded into a square of cloth, which he squeezed into the hot water and held until the color was right. He drank it standing, looking at the room. In daylight, even the indirect reflected daylight of the canyon, the room looked different than it had by flashlight, more complete. The walls that had seemed rough and provisional by artificial light showed themselves in the morning to be carefully considered, the stones not random but selected for flatness on their face, laid in courses that had been checked for level by someone who cared about level, even in a wall that no one would ever look at critically. The mortar between them was still tight. Not a crack in it, not a gap. 50 years of canyon humidity and freeze-thaw cycling, and the mortar was still tight. Silas set down his cup and put his hand flat against the wall. Whoever had mixed this mortar had gotten the ratio right and had tooled the joints while the mortar was still in the correct state of cure, not too wet, not too dry, so that the surface was slightly concave and would shed water rather than collect it. That was not an accident. That was knowledge applied with patience. He turned to the drawer. The nail through the wooden pull was a cut nail, not a wire nail, which meant it had been put there before wire nails were common enough to be the automatic choice, or by a man who used cut nails out of habit or preference. The angle of it suggested it had been driven carefully, not quickly. Driven to hold, not to lock. There was a difference. A lock said, "This is not for you." A hold said, "Be sure before you open this. Consider what you're doing." Silas had been considering for 12 hours. He worked the nail out with the claw end of the hammer he found hanging on the toolboard, fit the claw carefully under the head, rocked it gently, felt it give without the wood tearing. He set the nail on the bench. He gripped the wooden pull and opened the drawer. Inside was a folded piece of oilskin cloth, sealed at the edges with a bead of wax that had hardened and yellowed with age, but had not cracked. He lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the workbench and carefully worked the wax seal loose at one corner, then peeled back the oilskin. Inside was a map, not a survey map, not a government document. A hand-drawn map on heavy drafting paper, executed with the kind of precision that came from a man who understood spatial relationships the way other men understood language, naturally, completely, without having to translate. The canyon was there, rendered in fine pen lines, the cliff faces shown in cross-section, the rail grade marked with small parallel lines. The creek was there. The house was marked with a simple rectangle, and the notation structure complete 1968. And running beneath the canyon floor, following the fault line that Silas had noticed in the cliff face, where 2 types of stone met pale limestone against darker, denser rock, was a series of lines and notations that were not about the structure at all. They were about what was underneath it. The notations were technical, written in the shorthand of someone who had spent time studying geological survey reports. Silas could not read all of it. Geology was not his language, but some of it was plain enough. Depth estimates, sample points marked with small circles along the fault line. And at the bottom of the map, in Walter Kane's small, careful hand, silver-bearing quartz vein confirmed by surface sampling, 1966. Estimated extent, see attached survey reference GS-1964-MT-447. Below that, underlined twice, do not let them take this clean. Silas stood at the workbench for a long time. He looked at the map. He looked at the room around him. He looked at the tools on the pegged board, each one in its place, each one cared for and covered and left as if the man who owned them intended to come back and use them again. Walter Kane had not just built a room inside a cliff. He had built a room over a silver vein that someone else wanted badly enough that Walter had run from mineral springs in the winter of 1974 and hidden himself in a canyon that no road reached, and even then had not felt safe enough to stay. Silas folded the oilskin cloth back over the map, carefully working the edges flat. He did not reseal the wax. He put the oilskin in the inside pocket of his coat against his chest, the way a man carries something he is not willing to set down. Then he put on his boots and went to fix the water system. He spent the morning on the cliff face. He had found the seep the day before the crack in the limestone where groundwater emerged slow and cold and consistent, staining the rock below it with mineral deposits that showed it had been flowing for a very long time. He had found the ghost marks where the original collection fitting had been 2 bolt holes, the iron long rusted away the dark stains of where brackets had held a pipe against the face. He had the copper pipe from the workshop. He had the fittings in the second wooden crate. He had the tools on the board above the bench. He worked deliberately, drilled new anchor holes in the limestone beside the original ones. The limestone was competent here, not fractured, and it accepted the masonry bit cleanly. Fitted the collection housing against the seep face and packed the perimeter with hydraulic cement mixed from a small tin he found in the crate. A tin that had been sealed with its original lid and was still workable. Ran the copper pipe down the cliff face in 3 sections, soldering each joint with a small torch from the tool crate and the solder coiled in waxed paper beside it, solder that had oxidized on the surface but was still sound beneath. He did not hurry. He did not hurry because he had learned from Walter Kane, from the room Walter Kane had built, from the tools Walter Kane had left, from the ledger Walter Kane had kept, that the work done right the first time was the only work worth doing. Everything else was just doing it twice. By midday, the pipe was run. By early afternoon, he had fed it through the wall into the kitchen area and connected it to the copper stub that had been waiting there since 1969, capped and patient, holding its position through 5 decades of canyon winters because Walter Kane had sweated the cap on properly rather than just pressing it in and hoping. He opened the cap. He waited. The water came. Cold and slow at first, then steady. It ran into the stone basin Walter had fitted and mortared to the wall, fit and mortared the same way he had done everything else, with more care than the job strictly required, because that was the only level he knew how to work at. Silas put his hand under the water and held it there. Cold, clean. The faint mineral taste of limestone, which was the taste of water that had been inside the earth long enough to learn something from it. He pulled his hand out and dried it on his coat. Then he put the cap back on the stub and left the system ready for when he needed it again. He had work to do first. He went to town in the early afternoon, taking the rail grade down and coming out on Route 12 at the edge of Harrow Creek's gravel lot. He needed 2 things: masonry screws to replace the original iron bolts on the collection housing and information about a man named Walter Kane. The hardware store was shuttered, as he had seen on arrival. He found the masonry screws at the gas station, which kept a small rack of basic fasteners for the ranchers who came through without time to drive to the next county. The screws were not ideal too long, wrong alloy, but he could make them work. He tried the diner next. It was a Wednesday, so it was open. 3 tables occupied a counter with 4 stools, a woman in her 60s behind the counter, who had the look of a person who had been running this particular operation for so long that efficiency had become indistinguishable from personality. Her name, according to the hand-lettered sign on the register, was Bev. Silas sat at the counter and ordered coffee. He drank half of it, and then without particular preamble asked if anyone in Harrow Creek remembered a man named Walter Kane. The diner went quiet in a specific way. Not the silence of people who don't know the answer. The silence of people deciding how much of the answer to give. Bev set the coffee pot down on the warmer and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had been reading strangers at a counter for a very long time. She said, "Why are you asking?" Silas said he had known a man named Walt who had worked in the trades, a carpenter. He'd lost touch with him in the 70s and had reason to think he'd come through this part of Montana. Another silence. Shorter. Bev said, "Walter Kane went missing in 1969. Before my time here, but I know the story the way you know any story that people keep not quite talking about. He had property out east of town, some kind of claim. After he disappeared, the land sat for a couple of years, and then a fellow came through with papers showing it had reverted to unregistered status under the county's abandoned property rules. Bought it for almost nothing." She paused. "The fellow who bought it was named Fenwick. His son is Roy Fenwick. He's the one you'll see driving the white truck with the Fenwick Land Company logo on the door." Silas said, "Did anyone look for Walter Kane?" Bev said, "The sheriff at the time wrote it up as a voluntary disappearance. Man had no family here, no wife, no children that anyone knew of. Paid his bills, kept to himself, worked alone. The kind of man it's easy to stop looking for." She picked up the coffee pot again, though his cup was still 3/4 full. "People around here stopped saying his name after a while. Easier that way." Silas asked one more thing. He asked whether there was anyone in Harrow Creek who had known Walter Kane personally. Anyone still around? Bev thought about it. Then she said, "Clarence Fitch. He's 78 now. Used to run the feed store before his son took it over. He and Walter played chess on Saturday mornings for about 2 years before Walter disappeared. He doesn't talk about it, but he knew him." Silas thanked her and left $2 on the counter. He found Clarence Fitch sitting on a wooden bench outside the feed store, a heavy-set man with the unhurried stillness of someone who had made peace with the fact that there was no place urgently requiring his presence. He was watching the road with the patience of a man watching for weather. Silas sat down on the other end of the bench without asking. He looked at the road, too. After a minute, he said he had known a carpenter named Walt in 1974, a man who knew wood the way other men knew scripture. Clarence Fitch did not look at him. He looked at the road for a while longer. Then he said very quietly, "Walter Kane didn't disappear because he wanted to." He said it the way a man says something he has been not saying for a very long time with the careful release of a held breath. He said, "Walter found something on his property out east of town. Late 1965, early 1966. Mineral deposit. He wasn't looking for it. He was digging a drainage trench, and the color of the rock changed on him, and he knew what he was looking at because he'd done survey work in his 20s. He filed a claim properly, paid his fees, did everything right." Silas waited. Roy Fenwick's father, Gerald Fenwick, he had been buying land in the valley for 10 years. He found out about Walter's claim. And Gerald Fenwick was the kind of man who believed that finding out about something and owning something were more or less the same thing as long as you had the right lawyer and enough patience. Clarence paused. Walter held out for 3 years. Then one day he was just gone. Gerald Fenwick filed the abandoned property claim 8 months later. Another pause. "I always thought Walter was dead, but I never said so out loud because I had no proof. And in a town this size, saying a man was murdered without proof is just starting trouble." Silas put his hand in his coat pocket, felt the folded oilskin against his fingers, and said nothing. He thanked Clarence Fitch and walked back toward the east end of Main Street. That was when he saw the white truck, Fenwick Land Company, in clean blue letters on the door, parked in front of the county assessor's office, and leaning against the hood, talking on a cell phone. with the comfortable ease of a man who spent a great deal of time making calls that mattered, was a man Silas had never seen before, but who had the specific look of someone who had learned to use legal instruments the way other men used physical ones. Pressed shirt under a canvas work jacket. Haircut recently. Boots that had been purchased to look like work boots without ever having been used for work. Roy Fenwick was 49 years old, give or take, and he looked at the world with the expression of a man who had inherited enough of a head start that he had never fully understood what it meant to lose. He did not look at Silas. Silas did not slow down. He was halfway back to the rail grade when he heard footsteps behind him, quick, deliberate, closing the distance without running. He stopped and turned. Deputy Ada Croft was 38 years old, with the kind of steady eyes that came from years of watching people decide whether or not to tell her the truth. She was in uniform badge on her chest, hands at her sides, not threatening, not casual, present. She said, "You're the man staying up in the East Canyon." It was not a question. Silas said he had been up that way. She said, "Whatever you found up there, I need you to understand something before you do anything with it. Roy Fenwick has been filing land consolidation claims in this valley for 8 months. He has the county assessor on his side and a real estate attorney in Billings on retainer. He knows exactly what the abandoned property statutes allow him to do, and he has been doing all of it correctly." She paused, and something shifted slightly in her expression. "On paper." Silas looked at her. She said, "I have been trying to build a case against Fenwick's land acquisitions for 8 months. I have nothing that will hold in federal court. Nothing with a name on it. Nothing with a date." Another pause. "I don't know what's in that canyon. But I know Fenwick sent a man up there 3 nights ago to look at it, and I know that man came back and made a phone call that lasted 40 minutes. And I know that Fenwick was in the assessor's office first thing the next morning," Silas said. "What are you asking me?" She said, "I'm not asking you anything yet. I'm telling you that you have maybe 10 days before Fenwick files on that property under the reversion clause. After he files, it becomes a legal dispute, and the burden of proof shifts to whoever is contesting it. Before he files, it's still an open question." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you so you understand the clock." Silas said he understood clocks. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she said, "Be careful up there." And she turned and walked back toward the department truck without looking back. Silas stood on the edge of the road and watched her go. He was thinking about what she had said and what she had not said. She had not told him to leave. She had not told him the canyon was off limits. She had told him about the clock and told him to be careful, and given him information she was not strictly obligated to give him, which meant she needed something from him, even if she had not yet decided to ask for it directly. He started back up the grade. He was halfway through the alder scrub when he heard something and stopped. Below him on the grade, coming up from the valley, at a pace that was faster than casual and slower than alarmed, was a figure he recognized before the face was clear. The walk. The set of the shoulders, the particular way of moving that he had known since the person was 8 years old. Dean Cord was 41 years old, and had his mother's eyes and his father's hands, though he had not done the kind of work those hands were built for in a very long time. He was wearing clothes that were too light for the mountain air, a jacket from a city, not a working jacket, and he was looking up the grade with an expression that Silas read in a single glance. Not surprise, not guilt, a studied blankness, the kind a man wore when he had been told what to say and was rehearsing it. They stood on the rail grade in the shadow of the ridge and looked at each other. Dean said, "I didn't know you were here." Silas said, "Yes, you did." A silence. The alder moved in the canyon draft. Somewhere far above them, a hawk turned in the cold air over the ridge without effort, without sound. Dean said, "I'm here on business, with Fenwick Land Company. I've been doing some contract work for them. Survey prep mostly, property documentation." He said it quickly, like a man who had learned that saying a true thing fast enough could make it feel less like a confession. Silas looked at his son. He looked at him the way he looked at a piece of wood that had been stressed looking for where it had bent how much, and whether it had bent far enough that it could not be returned to true. He said, "How long?" Dean looked at the ground. 18 months. Silas counted backward. 18 months meant Dean had been working for Fenwick 6 months before the documents at the county clerk's office in Bozeman had been filed. 6 months before the house on Caldwell Road had ceased to be in Silas's name. 6 months of Dean sitting across from him at Eleanor's bedside in the evenings, asking how she was doing, whether there was anything he could help with. He stood very still. He did not feel what he might have expected to feel. Not rage, not the cold, collapsing thing that grief felt like. He felt something more like clarity, the feeling of a long equation finally resolved, of a piece of wood held up to the light at the right angle so that the grain that had been invisible before was suddenly perfectly visible. He had not understood why Fenwick had targeted him specifically. He had not understood why the documents had been so thorough, so carefully constructed, so legally airtight, the kind of work that required not just a good lawyer, but someone who knew the property, who knew Silas's habits, who knew exactly when Silas would be too occupied with Eleanor's illness to monitor what was happening to the paperwork on the house. Someone who had access to the house. Someone who had known the layout of the title documents. Someone who had been inside the filing cabinet in the study because Silas had trusted him to be. Someone who needed money badly enough, or who had been frightened badly enough to make a choice that could not be unmade. Dean was still looking at the ground. His hands were in his jacket pockets. His shoulders had the posture of a man waiting for a blow. Silas said, "Look at me." Dean looked up. Silas said, "Did you know what Fenwick was going to do with it?" A long silence. Dean's jaw worked. He said, "He told me it was a land consolidation deal, that you'd get a buyout, that you'd be taken care of." Silas said, "Did you believe him?" Another silence. Longer. Dean said very quietly, "No." The words sat between them on the rail grade like a stone dropped into still water. What it sent out from itself was a long series of ripples that neither of them could stop or call back. Silas said, "Why are you here now?" Dean said, "Fenwick sent me to confirm you'd moved on. He said someone had been seen going up the East Canyon, and he wanted to know if it was anyone connected to—" He stopped, started again. He said he needed to know if there was anyone who might complicate the filing. Silas said, "And are you going to tell him?" Dean looked at him. His mother's eyes. The expression in them was the one Silas recognized from when Dean was very young before the city. Before the money troubles, before whatever sequence of decisions had brought him to a mountain rail grade in October with a Fenwick Land Company business card in his jacket pocket. It was the expression of a person who understood that they were standing at a door they had been walking toward for a very long time, and that opening it would change everything after it. He said, "I don't know yet." Silas nodded. He said, "Then go back down. Think about it. I'll be here." He turned and walked up the grade without waiting to see what Dean did. He did not look back. He came back into the canyon as the light was going from the rim. He rebuilt the fire. He heated water. He sat at the workbench with the oilskin map open in front of him and his flashlight angled to read it, and he studied the geological notations the way he studied the grain of unfamiliar wood carefully, without rushing, looking for the thing underneath the surface that told you what the material was actually made of. After an hour, he put the map away and picked up the ledger. He turned to the last page with writing on it. March 14th, 1969. The final entry, which he had read the night before but now read again more slowly. Walter Kane had written, "They found the claim filing in the county records. Gerald Fenwick came to see me 2 days ago. He was polite. He is always polite. He made an offer that assumed I would accept it because he assumed I had no other option. I do not have many options, but I have built something here that they do not know about and cannot reach without knowing where to look. I am leaving tonight. I will not take the tools. The tools belong to this place. If someone finds this room and understands what they are looking at, they were meant to find it. I will not say where I am going, but I have not forgotten what this place is, and I have not forgotten what is under it. If someone reads this, the map is in the drawer. The proof is in the floor. Do not let them take it clean. Silas read the last line 3 times. The proof is in the floor. He set the ledger down. He looked at the floor. He picked up the flashlight and crouched down, moving the beam slowly across the planking. He was not looking for a seam or a panel or anything as obvious as a trap door. He was looking for what a craftsman would leave, something that required understanding to find invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. He moved to the iron cot frame. He pulled it away from the wall. He crouched and put the flashlight beam at a low angle, raking across the surface of the floor planks beneath where the cot had stood. There, not a panel, not a seam. 3 planks, slightly wider than the others, fitted into the floor at a point where the original framing would have placed a joist directly beneath them. Double-nailed at the edges with cut nails set at the same angle as every other nail in the floor. But the wood, the grain told it if you held the light at exactly the right angle and knew what you were looking at. These 3 planks had been removed and replaced after the floor was originally laid. The saw kerf on the ends was fractionally different from the boards on either side. The cut made after the adjacent boards were already in place, which left a tool mark that a casual eye would never catch. But Silas Cord was not a casual eye. He took the flat bar from the tool crate, worked the tip under the edge of the center plank at a nail, and lifted. The nail came up clean. He worked the plank free, lifted it, set it aside. The underside of the plank had been dressed smooth, not because the underside of a floor plank needed to be smooth, but because it needed to be a surface that would hold marks. And Walter Kane had used it exactly that way. Cut into the wood with a fine-pointed marking gauge pressed deep enough that no amount of time or moisture would obliterate it was a set of notations that covered the entire underside of the plank in Walter's small, careful hand. A legal property description, a claim number, a date, a surveyor's certification reference, a signature. Walter Kane's name cut into the wood of his own floor with his own tools in a room he had built with his own hands in a canyon that the world had set aside and forgotten about. Silas crouched over it with the flashlight and read every word. He put the plank back carefully, reset the nails, pulled the iron cot frame back into position. He had what he needed. He did not need to leave it exposed. He needed to leave it exactly where Walter Kane had left it, in the place that Walter had trusted, in the room that had held everything else. He banked the fire and lay back on the cot. He lay in the dark and thought about the clock that Deputy Ada Croft had described 10 days before Fenwick's filing, and about the oilskin map in his inside pocket, and the inscription in the floor, and the ledger on the shelf, and the tools on the board, all of it holding together in the dark of a canyon room that no one was supposed to find. He thought about Dean on the rail grade, standing with his hands in his pockets, and his mother's eyes, and the expression of a man deciding. He thought about Walter Kane walking out of Mineral Springs in the winter of 1974, with nothing but his hands and his knowledge and his refusal to be the kind of man who accepted what had been done to him as the final word on who he was. Silas had done the same thing for 3 years. The difference was that Walter Kane had come here. Walter had built something. Walter had left something behind that was waiting patient as the water in the cliff face for the right person to find it. And now, Silas Cord was lying on Walter Kane's cot in Walter Kane's room, with Walter Kane's tools on the wall, and the map in his pocket, and the proof in the floor, and outside the window, Roy Fenwick was counting days. He thought about what he had, and what he needed, and in what order the pieces had to move. He thought about it the way he thought through a complicated joint, not imagining the finished thing, but imagining the sequence of cuts that would produce it. Each cut in its order, each one making the next one possible. He knew what he was going to do. He knew how he was going to do it. The only thing remaining was to begin. He closed his eyes and let the canyon hold him, and outside the water moved through the cliff as it had always moved, and the mountain kept its silence as it had always kept it, and neither of them required anything of him, except that he be still for a few more hours before the next day began. The morning of the 8th day arrived, the way all consequential mornings arrived in the canyon, without announcement, without ceremony, in slow stages of light that asked nothing of the man inside the room and offered nothing except the fact of another day beginning. Silas had been awake since 4. He had not slept past 4 in 3 years. Sleep for a man who had lost everything in a quiet sequence of legal maneuvers while he was attending to his dying wife was not a thing that came easily or stayed long. It came when the body demanded it and left when the mind took over, and the mind of Silas Cord was a mind that preferred to work. He had spent the dark hours before dawn going over what he had. He did this the way he used to go over a set of plans before beginning a complicated piece, not looking for what was there, but looking for what was missing. A good craftsman knew that the gap in the plan was always more dangerous than the complexity in it. You could solve complexity with skill. A gap would undo you when you least expected it. What he had: the map in the oilskin, the inscription in the floor, the ledger, the photograph from 1974. What he had from outside Clarence Fitch's account of Walter Kane's disappearance, Bev's account of Gerald Fenwick's land acquisition, Ada Croft's 8 months of circumstantial investigation with nothing that would hold in federal court. What was missing: a direct chain of legal custody connecting Walter Kane's original claim, filing to the room in the canyon, without which the inscription in the floor was powerful evidence but not conclusive proof on its own. The oilskin map showed the mineral claim. The floor inscription showed Walter's claim reference number and certification. But a county records search would be needed to pull the original filing, and if Gerald Fenwick had been as thorough as the rest of the evidence suggested, that filing might have been altered, buried, or simply lost in the intervening 50 years. He needed the county records. He needed them before Fenwick filed. And he needed someone with the legal standing to pull them in a way that could not be subsequently challenged. At first light, he built the fire-heated water and made his decision. He took the oilskin from his inside pocket and opened it flat on the workbench. He took the ledger from the shelf. He took the photograph from his pack. He looked at all 3 items for a long moment, then wrapped the map back in the oilskin, tucked the ledger inside his coat, and left the photograph where it was. He went to find Ada Croft. She was in her department truck at the edge of the gravel lot, which told him she had been watching the rail grade for him. He did not find this surprising. He walked to the driver's side window, and she rolled it down and looked at him with those steady eyes that did not pretend at small talk. He said, "I need you to pull a county record. A mineral claim filing from 1966. The reference number is GS-1964-MT-447. The claimant is Walter Kane." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You found something?" He said, "I found several things. I need the filing before I show you what they are." She said, "If that filing exists in the county system, Fenwick's attorney will be notified the moment I query it. There's a flag on anything related to the East Canyon properties. Fenwick put it there 4 months ago." Silas said, "How long do you have between the query and the notification?" She thought about it. "Theoretically, the notification goes out at end of business. If I pull it first thing in the morning, I have a working day." He said, "Then pull it tomorrow morning. First thing." She said, "And tonight?" He said, "Tonight I need you to make a call to the Federal Land Management Office in Helena. Not a formal request, an informal conversation with whoever handles mineral claim disputes. You're asking a hypothetical question about the legal standing of a claim filed in 1966 if the original claimant disappeared and the land was subsequently acquired under an abandoned property statute." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "You know what you're doing." He said, "I know what needs to be done and in what order. That's not the same thing, but it's usually enough." She pulled out a notepad. GS-1964-MT-447, Walter Kane. She wrote it down without looking at it twice. Then she looked up at him and said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm a carpenter from Bozeman who used to own a house." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Be up in that canyon tomorrow afternoon. I'll come to you." He walked back up the grade. That evening, an hour before dark, Dean came. He came up the rail grade without a flashlight, which meant he had made his decision about something and had made it before the light failed, and was not going to let the dark change it. He came to the door of the canyon room and stood in the opening without knocking because the door was open and had been left open for him. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long time, at the tools on the board, at the stove, at the workbench and the fitted stone walls and the ceiling planks dressed by hand. He said, "You fixed the water." Silas said, "Yesterday." Dean stepped inside. He looked at the copper pipe running along the wall to the basin. He put his hand under the basin tap, the way Silas had done, the same gesture, the same stillness, and the water ran cold over his fingers. He pulled his hand back and dried it on his jeans. He stood there for a moment after looking at his own hand, the way a person looks at something that has surprised them about themselves. He said, "Fenwick knows you're here. He knows you've been in the canyon. He has a filing ready to go. He's been waiting to see if you'd leave on your own." Silas said, "And if I don't?" Dean said, "He files anyway. He has the legal framework in place. The county assessor has already pre-approved the abandoned property designation." He paused. "He sent me up here to tell you that there's no version of this where you win, that the best thing is to walk away." Another pause longer. "He doesn't know I've already decided not to tell him that." Silas looked at his son. Dean was standing in a Walter Kane's room with his hands at his sides, and his mother's eyes and the studied blankness that had been on his face on the rail grade 2 days ago was gone. What was underneath it was not comfortable to look at. It was the expression of a man who had added up a column of numbers he had been avoiding for 18 months and had arrived at a sum he could not dispute. Silas said, "Sit down." Dean sat on the edge of the cot. Silas sat on the stool at the workbench. The stove burned between them, and the fire made the room the same color as the light in old photographs. Silas opened the ledger and set it on Dean's knee. He said, "Read the last entry." Dean read it. He read it twice the way Silas had. Then he sat with it on his knee and said nothing for a while. Silas said, "The man who built this room was named Walter Kane. He was a carpenter, the best one I ever knew, and I knew him before I knew his name. He found a silver vein on his property in 1966 and filed a legal claim, and Gerald Fenwick, Roy Fenwick's father, spent 3 years trying to buy him out. When Walter wouldn't sell Gerald, Fenwick waited until Walter disappeared and then filed an abandoned property claim on the land." He paused. "Roy Fenwick grew up on land that his father acquired that way. Now Roy Fenwick is doing what his father did. He came after Walter's Canyon because he found the geological surveys in the county records and understood what was underneath it, and when he needed someone who knew the local property system and could help him prepare the paperwork, he found you." Dean said nothing. Silas said, "He didn't choose you by accident, Dean. He chose you because you had access to me and because he knew that what he needed from me, the house on Caldwell Road, could be used as leverage. Not against me directly, against you. He put you in a position where you owed him, and then he collected." Dean looked at the ledger. He said, "How do you know all this?" Silas said, "Because I read Wood, and Walter Kane left everything written down." He stood up and moved to the iron cot frame and pulled it away from the wall. He crouched and worked the center plank free, the same 3 nails, the same careful lift, and held the flashlight at the low angle so the inscription was visible. Dean crouched beside him and read it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is a legal property description," Silas said, "with a claim number, a certification reference, and a signature cut into old-growth pine by a man who understood that paper can be altered and wood cannot." He set the plank back. "That's the proof. And tomorrow morning, Ada Croft is pulling the original filing from county records. When she has it, she's taking everything to the Federal Land Management Office in Helena." Dean sat back on his heels. He said, "Fenwick will challenge it. He has the county assessor. He has the pre-approval. He has 18 months of groundwork," Silas said. "He has all of that, and on the other side there's a mineral claim filed legally in 1966 by a man who was subsequently run off his land by Fenwick's father, with the physical evidence of that claim preserved in the original claimant's handwriting, in the original claimant's structure on the original claimant's property." He looked at Dean. "One of those things is paperwork. The other one is stone and wood, and 56 years of a canyon keeping its own record. Dean looked at the floor. He said, "What do you need from me?" Silas said, "A written account of what Fenwick instructed you to do. When he approached you, what he asked you to document, what role you played in the Bozeman property transfer. Dates, amounts, instructions, all of it." He paused. "It won't be comfortable." Dean said, "No." Silas said, "It won't fix what happened to the house." Dean said, "I know." A long silence. The stove burned. The creek ran outside in the dark. Dean said, "I told myself it was a business arrangement, that you'd be fine, that you were tough enough to land on your feet." He stopped, started again. "I told myself a lot of things that I knew weren't true while I was telling them." Silas said nothing. He did not say it was all right, because it was not all right, and he was not a man who said things that were not true simply because the moment requested them. He said, "Write it down tonight, all of it. I need it tomorrow afternoon." Dean nodded. He stood. He looked at the room one more time, the walls, the tools, the ceiling. His eyes moved over it slowly, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand the full weight of before they leave. He said, "He built all of this alone." Silas said, "Every stick of it." Dean said, "Why?" Silas considered the question. He said, "Because he needed to prove to himself that what had been done to him wasn't the final word on what he was capable of." He looked at his son directly. "Men do that. When everything else is taken, they build something. It's the only answer that means anything." Dean left without saying anything more. Silas listened to his footsteps on the grade until they were gone entirely. Then he sat at the workbench and did not read. He did not pick anything up. He simply sat with his hands on the surface of the bench that Walter Kane had built and bolt-fixed to the stone wall in 1961, and he let the room be what it was for a few quiet minutes before the next thing began. Ada Croft came up the canyon at 2 in the afternoon the following day. She came alone, which was what Silas had expected. She was carrying a folder, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had found what she was looking for and was not yet sure how she felt about having found it. She sat on the stool at the workbench. Silas sat on the cot frame. She opened the folder. She said, "The filing exists. GS-1964-M to -447. Walter Kane Mineral Claim filed March 1966, confirmed by County Survey Office fees paid through 1969. She paused. It was never formally contested and never formally withdrawn. It was administratively suspended in 1971 under a provision that allowed the county to suspend inactive claims if the claimant could not be located. The suspension was initiated by the county assessor's office. Silas said, "Who was the county assessor in 1971? She said, "A man named Harold Greer. He retired in 1984. He died in 1999. She looked at him. "But his son-in-law is the current county assessor, the same one who pre-approved Fenwick's abandoned property designation on the East Canyon." Silas said, "There it is." She said, "It gets worse. When I pulled the filing this morning, there was a notation added to the digital record, not in the original handwriting. Typed in, no date, no initialing. It says, claim validity disputed, see adjacent file, GF-1971-03. The adjacent file is a letter from Gerald Fenwick's attorney arguing that Walter Kane had abandoned the claim by vacating the property. She set the folder down on the workbench. The letter is undated. It was inserted into the county's digital archive when the records were converted to digital format in 2009. There's no corresponding physical document in the original files. Silas said, "Someone inserted it during digitization." She said, "Someone inserted it during digitization. And the contractor who oversaw that digitization project had a business relationship with Fenwick Land Company. I found that this morning as well. It took me 40 minutes to find what I should have been able to find 8 months ago because I didn't have the right reference number to start from." She looked at him. GS-1964-MT-447 gave me everything. Silas reached inside his coat and took out the oilskin. He unfolded it on the workbench beside her folder. He showed her the map, the canyon, the fault line, the mineral notations, the reference to GS 1964, MT 447 in Walter's handwriting. He showed her the ledger. He showed her the photograph from 1974. Then he moved the cot frame and lifted the center plank and held the flashlight at the angle so she could read the inscription. She crouched and read every word. She read it twice. Then she stood and looked at the room, at the walls, at the tools in their order, on the board, at the ceiling planks dressed by hand, and for the first time since Silas had met her, something moved in her expression that was not professional and measured. It was the look of a person who had been working a long time in the dark, and a light had come on from a direction they were not expecting. She said, "This is enough." Silas said, "For Helena." She said, "For Helena, for a federal mineral rights dispute, for a fraud investigation into the 2009 digitization records." She paused. "And when I add Dean Cord's written account of what Fenwick instructed him to do in connection with the Bozeman property transfer, it becomes enough to pull Roy Fenwick's land acquisition files across the entire valley." Silas handed her the 3 folded pages that Dean had slid under the canyon door before dawn. He had heard the footsteps on the grade at just past midnight quiet. Careful, the footsteps of a man who had been writing for several hours and had finished and did not want to wait until morning to deliver what he had written. Ada took the pages and read them standing at the workbench. Her face was still. Her eyes moved quickly and did not stop moving until she had read every word on all 3 pages. When she finished, she folded the pages and put them in the folder with the county filing. She said, "I'm going to Helena this afternoon. I have a contact at the Federal Land Management Office who has been waiting 8 months for something he could act on." She closed the folder. "This is something he can act on." Silas said, "How long?" She said, "If they move quickly, and they will move quickly because a fraudulent insertion into a county's digital archive is a federal records violation that they take seriously. Fenwick will be served with a federal notice of dispute before he can file his abandoned property claim. Once that notice is served, the clock stops. He can't file while a federal dispute is active." Silas said, "And the canyon?" She said, "Walter Kane's original claim is still legally active. It was suspended, not terminated. A suspended claim can be reinstated if the original claimant or their legal successor can demonstrate continuous association with the property." She looked at the room slowly, the way she had looked at the inscription in the floor. "I'd say this room constitutes continuous association." She picked up her folder and looked at Silas. She said, "You understand that this process won't be quick. Even with the federal dispute filed, the legal resolution could take months, possibly longer." Silas said, "I have time." She said, "Where will you be?" He looked at the room. He said, "Here." She nodded once. Then she said something that surprised him, not because of what it was, but because of how directly she said it without preamble. "Walter Kane built a good room." Silas said, "He was a good craftsman." She said, "So are you." And she left. 3 days later, Roy Fenwick came up the canyon himself. He had not filed yet. The federal dispute notice had arrived at his attorney's office the day before his filing window opened, which had brought exactly the margin Silas had calculated when he sent Ada to Helena. Fenwick would know that. He would also know that sending Roy Dills up the canyon had become a liability. The county sheriff's truck had been parked outside Dills's rental at dawn 2 days running, which explained why Dills was not among the men Fenwick brought with him now. Fenwick came with 2 others, not men. Silas recognized, but men with the particular quality of people who are paid to stand behind someone important and not say anything. Fenwick himself came in through the canyon in the early afternoon, and when he saw the door standing open, he stopped at the base of the cliff and looked up at the overhang and at the vines and at the light coming through the open doorway, and his expression was the expression of a man recalculating. He came to the door and knocked on the frame, a courtesy that told Silas more about the shift in the situation than anything else could have. A man who knocked before entering a place he considered his own was a man who was no longer certain it was his. Silas said, "Come in." Fenwick came in. He looked at the room, the tools on the board, the workbench, the stove burning, the copper pipe running along the wall to the basin. He looked at Silas on the stool at the workbench. He looked at the ledger open on the bench and the oilskin folded beside it. He said, "You've been busy," Silas said. "I fixed the water system, repaired the mortar on the north section of the east wall. The door threshold needs to be relieved about 1/8 of an inch. It's been swollen from decades of moisture. I'll get to that." Fenwick looked at him steadily. He said, "You know this property is in the process of being designated abandoned land under the county's reversion statute," Silas said. It was. The process has been suspended by a federal dispute notice filed 2 days ago by the Land Management Office in Helena, citing an active mineral claim, GS-1964-MT-447, that was fraudulently annotated in the County Digital Archive in 2009. He paused. "You'll have received the notice yesterday. I'm guessing that's why you're here." Fenwick's expression did not change dramatically. He was, as Clarence Fitch had said about his father, always polite. He said, "Whatever you think you found up here," Silas said. "I found a mineral claim filed legally in 1966. I found a map of the claim in a sealed drawer. I found the claim reference number and certification cut into the underside of a floor plank by the original claimant in a room the original claimant built by hand on his own property. I found a ledger documenting 8 years of continuous occupation." He paused. "And I found a photograph of the original claimant taken in 1974, which I can place in the same county as your father's initial land acquisition activity in the same year, which raises the question of why Walter Kane left that county in a hurry in the winter of 1974, the same winter your father increased his property acquisitions significantly and closed his file on the East Canyon claim." The room was very quiet. Fenwick said, "You can't prove any connection between my father and—" Silas said, "Your father's attorney inserted an undated, unauthorized letter into the county's digital archive in 2009. The letter disputed Walter Kane's mineral claim. The insertion was made during the digitization process, which your father's business associate oversaw in his capacity as a contractor to the county. The county assessor who approved the digitization contract is the son-in-law of the man who suspended Walter Kane's mineral claim in 1971 at your father's request." He looked at Fenwick without heat, without urgency, with the same steadiness with which he looked at a piece of wood he had already decided how to work. "The Federal Land Management Office finds the chain of connection straightforward enough to warrant a full records audit. So does the Montana Attorney General's office, which received a separate filing this morning." Something moved behind Fenwick's eyes. Not panic, he was not a man who panicked. But the careful, continuous recalculation that had been running since he walked through the door had arrived at a new number, and the new number was not one he had prepared for. He said, "What do you want?" The question came out with less polish than everything before it. It came out like the question it actually was, direct, undecorated, stripped of the legal language that usually surrounded it. Silas said, "I want what Walter Kane wanted. Legal recognition of a valid mineral claim on this property, the reinstatement of the claim to active status, and a full audit of every land acquisition your company has made in this valley under the abandoned property statute." He paused. "And I want the Bozeman property reviewed." Fenwick said, "The Caldwell Road property was acquired through a legitimate—" Silas said, "Through an arrangement involving my son, whom you recruited and placed in a position of financial obligation over 18 months, and who has provided a written account of your instructions to him, including the specific timeline of the Bozeman transfer to the Federal Land Management Office, the County Sheriff's Department, and the Montana Attorney General's Office." He looked at Fenwick. "Your attorney will tell you what that account means for the Bozeman transfer." Fenwick stood in the room for a long moment. He looked at the tools on the board. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Silas sitting on the stool with his hands flat on the workbench, the same position he sat in when he was thinking through a problem, not when he was finished with one. Still working. still reading the grain of whatever was in front of him. Then Fenwick turned and walked out through the door, and his two men followed him, and their footsteps went down the canyon grade, measured and deliberate, and after a while the sound of them was gone, and the canyon was quiet again. The creek ran. A hawk crossed the strip of sky above the rim without pausing. Silas sat on the stool at the workbench. He sat there for a long time without moving. Not from exhaustion, not from relief. He sat the way he sat at the end of a long and complicated job, still present in the particular quiet that came after the work was done, but before the next thing had announced itself, the space between the last stroke and putting the tools away. That evening, Dean called from the road. Silas heard the phone ring in his coat pocket and looked at the name on the screen for a moment before he answered. Dean said, "I talked to the Attorney General's office this morning. They want a second interview." Silas said, "All right." A pause. "I'm going to give it to them. Everything." Another pause, shorter. "Dad," Silas said, "I know." A longer pause. The sound of wind on Dean's end. He was outside somewhere, standing in it. Then, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't," Silas said, "drive careful." And he ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he put it in his coat pocket and sat with his hands on the workbench. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about what she would have said about all of it, the canyon, the room Walter Kane, the inscription in the floor. She would have said very little. She had been like Silas, a person who expressed what mattered through doing rather than saying. She had planted a garden every spring at the house on Caldwell Road, even in the years when her health made it difficult, because the alternative was to stop. And she had decided a long time ago that stopping was not a language she was willing to speak. He picked up the shoulder plane from the bench. Not to examine it, he had examined it enough. He took it because the door threshold needed work, and the work was waiting, and there was still an hour of light left in the canyon. He crossed to the door, crouched at the threshold, and held the plane at the angle the job required. He took the first shaving. It came off thin and clean and curled away from the blade in a single continuous spiral, catching the last light from the canyon rim. He took another, and another. He worked without hurry and without distraction, each shaving thin, each pass going with the grain the way he had been taught. He did not think about Fenwick, or the federal process, or the months of legal work that would follow, or what the review of the Bozeman property would produce. Those things would proceed at their own pace, and they would find what they found, and he had set them in motion as correctly as he knew how to set them. The rest was not in his hands. What was in his hands was the plane and the door, and the threshold that needed 1/8 of an inch taken from it, so the door would hang right and seal right, and last the way things lasted when they were maintained. When the threshold was right, he stood. He swung the door. It moved through its arc cleanly without resistance at the bottom, and seated itself against the frame with the particular sound that a well-fitted door made, not a thud, not a click, but something between the two. The sound of one carefully made thing meeting another and finding that they fit. He stood in the open doorway and looked out at the canyon. The light had left the walls and the stone had gone from pale gold to the deep gray blue of early evening. The creek ran below. The wind that had been in the timber all day had settled, and the canyon held the particular stillness of a place that had been undisturbed for a long time and had grown comfortable with its own silence. He hung the shoulder plane on its peg on the board above the bench, in the space where Walter Kane had hung it beside the jack plane and the jointer. Each one in its place, each one in the order that made sense to a man who understood planes and how they were used. He built the fire up from the banked coals. He heated water. He sat at the workbench with his hands around the cup and looked at the room. The walls Walter had laid stone by stone. The ceiling Walter had dressed plank by plank. The floor with its secret cut into the wood by the hand that had built everything around it. The tools in their order on the pegged board. The copper pipe running to the basin and the water waiting in it cold and clean from the cliff face. Patient in the way that water was always patient, unchanged by the decades it had spent moving through the dark interior of the mountain. Silas thought about what it meant to build something that held. He had been asking that question his entire working life, and the answer was always the same, though he had found different ways to understand it at different ages. At 24, it had meant technical skill, the right joint, the right fit, the right fastener for the load. At 40, it had meant something broader, the right material for the right place, the structure that worked with the forces acting on it rather than against them. At 67 in this room, it meant something he did not have a clean word for. It meant building something true enough that it could hold its own record. Building something honest enough that even if you were taken away from it, even if someone tried to erase you from the legal documents and the public memory and the county records, the thing itself would remember. The thing itself would carry your name in the only language that could not be falsified, the language of the work, the grain of the wood, the angle of the joint, the fit of the door in the frame. Walter Kane had understood that. He had built this room knowing he might have to leave it, and he had built it in such a way that leaving it didn't mean losing it. He had trusted the work to hold what he could not stay to hold himself. And the work had held. Through 56 winters and one long silence and the patient, relentless pressure of men who wanted what was under the ground beneath it, the work had held. Silas set down his cup. He looked at the canvas pack in the corner, the same corner where he had propped it on the first night he was here. He had not laid it flat. He had propped it upright the way a man props a pack when he expects to lift it again soon. He crossed to it. He lifted it from the corner and laid it flat on the floor. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. The way a man sets something down when he has been carrying it long enough and the time for carrying it is over. The pack lay on the floor of Walter Kane's room. The fire ticked, the water ran. Outside the canyon, the first stars were coming visible above the rim, appearing one at a time as the sky deepened, each one settling into its place without announcement. Silas went to the workbench and looked at what remained to be done. He catalogued it in the way he had always catalogued work, starting with what would fail soonest if left unaddressed, moving toward what could wait. The north wall needed repointing in 2 places where the mortar had finally given way after 5 decades. The cot frame needed new rope lacing. The current lacing was dry and would begin to fail before another hard winter. The stovepipe collar needed to be reseated where it entered the ceiling plate. The firewood stack needed to be replenished before the weather turned. The window on the east wall needed a new sash cord, and the glass in the lower pane needed to be reglazed where the putty had dried and separated from the wood. There was enough work here to carry a man through the winter. Through the winter and through whatever came after it, the legal proceedings in their time. The valley's quiet rearrangement as Phoenix acquisitions were examined and some of them unwound. The slow reappearance of Walter Kane's name in the county's records in the place it had always belonged, set there by the man himself in the wood of his own floor in a room no map had ever acknowledged. And somewhere in that process, a property review in Bozeman. Silas did not know what it would produce. He knew what was in Dean's written account, and he knew what the documents showed, and he knew the Attorney General's office would find what it found. He was not building expectations about it. Expectations were a kind of weight, and he had put the pack down. What he knew was this. He was 67 years old, and he had a tool belt and the knowledge in his hands of how to build things that lasted, and he was standing in a room that a man he had known at 24 had built alone inside a mountain in the belief that honest work was its own form of testimony. Walter Kane had been right about that. The work was its own testimony. It always had been. He picked up the ledger from the workbench and opened it to the last entry one more time. He read the final line. If someone reads this, the map is in the drawer. The proof's in the floor. Do not let them take it clean. He closed the ledger and set it back on the shelf in the place where he had found it. They had not taken it clean. He went to the door and stood in the open frame for a moment, looking up at the strip of sky above the canyon rim. The stars were fully out now, the whole scatter of them, the way they appeared at elevation in October, when the air was cold and dry and there was nothing between you and them except distance. He stood and looked at them for a while, without naming any of them or counting them or doing anything with them except allowing them to be what they were. Then he stepped back inside, closed the door, which moved now without resistance, which seated itself cleanly in the frame, which fit the way it was supposed to fit, and went to put another piece of wood on the fire. The room held the heat the way it always had. The stone walls absorbed it and gave it back slowly and evenly, the way good construction always managed temperature without being asked, without effort, simply by being built correctly in the first place. Silas sat at the workbench. He put both hands flat on the surface that Walter Kane had made in 1961 from timber he had carried into a canyon with no road on a bench. He had bolted directly to the stone wall, because he understood that a workbench was only useful if it did not move, and he sat with his hands on it and let himself be still. Outside, the canyon kept its silence. The creek ran where it had always run. The water moved through the cliff face in the dark as it had moved for centuries, cold and clean and entirely without urgency, finding its way through the stone by the oldest method available to anything patience and the willingness to keep moving in the direction that was true. Inside, the fire burned. The room was warm. The tools hung in their order on the board above the bench, each one in its place, each one ready for the work that would begin again in the morning. Silas Cord sat in the room that Walter Kane had built and let the night come down around it, and for the first time in 3 years the stillness did not feel like something he was waiting to end. It felt like something he had arrived at. He was home,